It's good to be back in Reedville again. It's nice to see you all, and I especially want to thank Ben Hume for a wonderful crab supper we enjoyed prior to coming over here. I'm going to kind of wander around the boondocks tonight, and at my age I enjoy sitting down. Please bring them back up. I don't enjoy. Can you bring up the front nice little bit again? I'm going to talk about today's problems and history's problems, and then take a few questions. Right now, as I'm sure many of you know, I'm in the middle of the monument fight, and I welcome the contest. I've got General Lee on my side, and we will win. There was a moment's hesitation. They sent a film crew down from New York to film me for CBS Sunday Morning. And we went out to Monument Avenue and got ready to shoot the first interview. And the guy, Mo, I forget what his last name was, Mo said, now, 6 million people will see this, but don't let that upset you. and off we went. We've got the monument thing, I think, pretty much in control. As much in control as you can put idiots. The airheads are taking over this country. And we laugh at some of the things they say, but we shouldn't. Because history is the best teacher you're ever going to have. And you take our history away, and we've got nothing. The first axiom I ever learned in graduate school is that any nation that forgets its past has no future. And that's what these snowflakes are doing. I like to call them snowflakes. They appear suddenly, and then they quickly melt from the warmth of intelligence and common sense. They say absolutely stupid things. And I'll give you an example of this momentarily. The first problem with all of this monument mess is American education. It's in crisis. And we don't think about it, but it is. Our kids are getting nowhere near the quality of schooling you and I got. And it's because computer science is taking over the world. And from the moment they enter the public school system, they start taking computer science courses. Now, in taking computer science courses, something's got to give. So they've thrown out, quote, quote, useless stuff. Geography classes, history classes, penmanship, English grammar, and the like. You've just thrown it away. And if you need examples, geography, I'll give you one, geography. The students of Boston, Massachusetts, about 100,000 of them, were recently given a map showing the 48 contiguous states. And all these kids were asked to do, from first grade to 12, was to identify the states. And they have 48 choices. The average score, 4. They could identify California, Texas, Florida, and guess one, maybe New York. Amazingly few knew where Massachusetts was. And this was done in Boston. That's typical. In history, it's the same thing. 90% of the American people cannot pass a simple American history exam. And this has been shown over and over again. Jesse Waters started it on Fox, but you see it all the time. 9 out of 10 Americans cannot tell you what the Declaration of Independence is, who Abraham Lincoln was. They can't define what a democracy is. They don't know, because they are not being taught that. I have a stepdaughter who teaches high school up at Roanoke, and she's telling me some amazing thing about graduating high school seniors. Many of them, and you're going to think about this for a moment, many of them cannot tell you what a clock on the wall says. Those 2 pointers don't make any sense to them. If it's a number, they can see it, but if it's pointers, they don't know. And even worse than that, they can print their names, but they can't sign them. They don't know how to write. And I see this over and over again. I can tell a computer science person when he or she comes in to write something. They write like they're holding an ice pick. And it's the state of education in this country. And we've got to stop it. We've got to improve it. And I think it's certainly got to start improving it at the college level. Campuses have always been centers of education. Nowadays, too many are centers for agitation. And we just run into examples of personal stupidity here. Recently, there was a demonstration at the University of Wisconsin, one of the academic centers of the nation. And the reporter went up to a bunch of demonstrators standing in front of the statue and said, "Oh, who are you demonstrating against?" He said, "That statue." And the reporter asked, "Who is it?" And the guy replied, "It's Abraham Lincoln, a well-known slaveholder." Abraham Lincoln unlocked the door to freedom for all races with his Emancipation Proclamation. And here are a bunch of college kids accusing him of being a racist. Now, let's talk about slavery and the coming of the war. You know, to hear the snowflakes tell it, nobody was practicing slavery until 1860, or 1787. Only Americans were really involved with slavery. Slavery goes back to thousands of years before Jesus. The ancient Egyptians in the year 3000 BC put up all these monuments, and they built it with slave labor. Slavery was dominant for thousands of years. And well into the 19th century, the 1800s, slavery dominated the world, especially the Western world, including, quote, quote, enlightened Europe and North America. And in that atmosphere, with there always being slavery there, is it not natural that a feeling of white supremacy would evolve? After all, what examples of black equality have they shown us in this Western world? Well, none. And the answer you and I know is they were never given the opportunity, but that's hindsight. And hindsight is always 20/20. But to the people who lived in the 1700s and the 1800s, slavery was a natural order of things. It had been for thousands of years, and white supremacy was a natural sequel to it all. And thus, we come up to the period of the Civil War, which basically it was caused by slavery, but there are a lot of things you have to add to that. I've never succumbed to the Ken Burns interpretation that slavery is the only cause of the war. Mr. Burns needs to read some books too. It's a little late now, but after his documentary. But there are enormous mistakes in his very popular documentary for public television. And as a result of that, we just have some real problems here. Slavery was an issue. State rights was an issue. When the Founding Fathers got through their work and gave us that miracle of God called the United States Constitution, they left out two things, both on purpose. The Constitution doesn't mention slavery or the elimination of it, because the Founding Fathers said this issue is too big, it's too deep-rooted for us to make a decision now. We will let time take its course. And time did take its course. By 1860, slavery is dying. And it's dying from the agricultural reason, not economic or political. It's dying from an agricultural reason. My hometown is Danville. You know, US 360 ends right down here. You get on 360 and keep driving west, and it's going to end at the intersection of Main Street and Riverside Drive in my hometown, Danville. Now, Danville was also, in its day, the world's largest tobacco market. And so I grew up in a tobacco atmosphere, working on a farm, on my grandfather's farm in the summertime. Tobacco takes everything that the soil has to offer and more. We did not have the theory of crop rotation back then. And so you just kept planting cotton in the same field, tobacco in the same field, cotton and tobacco do alike. They sap all the energy in the soil. And soon you keep planting until the field will not grow weeds. Then you abandon that useless land and go find other field. And this is why Southerners were always fighting for expanding the nation westward, thinking that maybe we can get tobacco fields in Denver or cotton fields in Albuquerque, all these unrealistic things. But it wasn't going to work out that way, and cotton was going to die as the economic king of America, especially since in the North they were enjoying the Industrial Revolution. America was becoming more industrial as the nation was becoming less agricultural. And so slavery does play a factor in this, very much so, in the coming of the war. But in addition to slavery, I think you've got to take up this King Cotton versus the Industrial Revolution. I think you've got to take up state rights, and I'll mention that more at length when I get to General Lee. And for those of you who are in my class at Tech, and I thank you for reminding me tonight how old I am. I tell you what years you took the course, and you two know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, if you come up, don't tell me when you took the course, just say, I took the course. Before long, I'm going to be looking to the east for the sign of the resurrection, and the people go back so far, if you will. But in addition to all of these points, I always emphasize emotionalism. I always have said people's feelings had much to do with the coming of the war. We were too young to fight each other with any confidence. We were too young to be a nation. We were not well versed in anything. 90% of the American people in 1860 had never been out of their county and never would be. Nobody traveled. Nobody was well-read or well-traveled. We were all right together, and so locked into our own environment, we loved more intensely. And when you love more intensely, you tend to hate more intensely too. And I found this in college students. I did for 44 years at Tech. You can bring in a college student real interested. They think in extremes. They don't like, they love. They don't dislike, they hate. They get in heat, come together, and soon they get married. Now they got a problem. They loved each other long enough to get married, but now they got to like each other to stay married. And that's difficult to do, just liking somebody and not loving somebody. And emotionalism, I think, will play a very strong role in the coming of the war. Now, one of the three subjects on which I wanted to make some comments tonight, let's start with Virginia. And the snowflakes just have no sense of history. They try to make the past appear as it is for the present, and you can't do that. When you look back, you have to look back through the blinders of the past to see only what they saw. Today, of course, the snowflakes are talking about the government doing this, the government doing that. Well, granted, you and I know that the federal government today does everything for us but breathe. We give them time, they'll get that too. But it's all powerful. In contrast, in 1860, 150 years ago, if you will, in 1860, the federal government directly touched your life one way. It delivered the mail to your local post office. That is the only contact you had with the federal government. Because the second point in the Founding Fathers' absenteeism, if you will, was that they did not settle the question of what we call federalism, meaning where does the power of the states end, where does the power of the federal government begin? They thought, correctly so, that time would tell, that in the natural course of developing X number of states into a oneness, that they would work out the difference. Well, we've worked it out now, there's no question but that the federal government reigns over this, which is why I feel so sorry for that stupid mayor of Oakland. He's probably going to be hauled up on conspiracy or obstructing justice now for refusing to obey federal law. She, as mayor of Oakland, is refusing to let federal agents come into town in search of illegal immigrants. A direct violation of federal law, and as clear as it can be. But we've settled that. The war will settle that. If the South had won, of course, state rights would still be premier. But ultimate sovereignty, where power basically lies, is today the federal government. So you can't look back at that time and say the South was guilty of massive treason, and there really wasn't that much to take over. We were 70 years old as a nation, the United States. 70 years old when the war began. The Commonwealth of Virginia was about 235 years old when war came. 3 times older. We are the mother state. And that's why people get bored with us Virginians. We talk so much about our history, but damn it, we've got so much history to talk about. and so we do. But Virginia was sovereign. In 1787, when the Constitution was formed and the nation was built, Virginia was 180 years old. And so when the secession crisis comes, Robert E. Lee has a decision to make. He has been a brilliant Army officer for 32 years, but he has been a Virginian all his life. And generations of Lees have been in Virginia. And Lee is faced with that dilemma. What do I do? And in February 1861, he wrote a system and said, I cannot draw my sword against my country, my family, my friends, my birthright. And his birthright is Virginia. And so when the crisis comes, and again the unintelligent make no attempt to learn this, Lee does resign from the Army in April 18, 1861. But Lee did not resign from the Army to join the Confederate movement. A simple reading of any textbook will tell you that. He left the Army to go home and defend his native state. And Virginia had just seceded. And Robert E. Lee had no idea which way Virginia went. He hoped, as a good Army officer, he hoped that war might be avoided. But it wasn't, and Virginia cast her lot with her southern sisters. And this produces something that we all accept for granted, but we never really think it through. Had Virginia remained in the Union, Lee would have fought for the Union. You ever thought about it? He would not have hesitated. He would have fought for the North in that war because Virginia is his home. Now, people today just don't have the knowledge or the ability to think back clearly to those days of old. You can't put 1860 in the same framework as 2018. It doesn't fit. They knew so little about it. I speak to medical societies quite often on Civil War medicine, which sounds ominous. Man, that guy, he knows everything. Well, medical science was still in the dark ages. It doesn't take a lot of education to learn what little medical science knew at that time. And so you run into people who say, how could they let this exist? How could they let that take place? Surely such and such could have been done. It wasn't. There was no such word as a germ. Bacteriology was coined, I think, in 1869. The great discoveries of Lister and Pasteur, which are the basic foundation of medicine, were introduced in this country in 1871. They still bled you if you had high fever. The idea is you got so much heat in you, we got to bring some of that heat out. And so they purposely take a razor and slash your wrist and let you bleed a while. And before long, you're not heated any longer, you're getting white. Because you're getting anemic, you're about to die. Well, the surgeons didn't know this. But they went along what they were taught was tradition and custom. So the point I'm trying to make in all this rambling is you can't look at yesterday through the visions of today. You and I use a lot of hindsight looking back, but we always must keep in mind what was going on at that time. What was the environment like at that time? And Robert E. Lee, of course, is the man around whom it all revolves, at least for us here in Virginia. That he was a brilliant soldier, no one will doubt. At least no one who knows anything about military service will doubt. Commanders all the way up to Dwight Eisenhower. They called him one of the most brilliant commanders the military has ever known. He was brilliant. He was brilliant in many, many ways. He was always unpredictable because he never did the predictable. And if you gave up, if you loosened up on Lee just a little, give him just a spark, he would grab the offensive. And you would be the result of it. And so for 4 years, he waged war as no other American had ever done before. Always, he was limited in men, limited in supplies. Always the underdog. But he kept going and kept going until there was simply and literally nowhere else to go. And he arrived in a little hamlet called Appomattox Courthouse, and he was totally surrounded. And if you read the accounts of the meeting between Lee and Grant, you'll find out very, very quickly that the man most uncomfortable in William McLean's front parlor that day was Grant. Grant had done what nobody had ever done before. He had brought the great gray fox to bay. He had him. And Grant was embarrassed by it all. But to his credit, and it takes two people to dance, I always tell folks when I'm doing a tour of Appomattox for them, remember Lee's humility and dignity and gallantry and surrendering. But also remember Grant. He deserves it too. He had Lee. Grant could have done whatever he wanted with Lee, and nobody could have stopped him. Lee was responsible for thousands of Union deaths. Grant could have hanged him from the nearest tree if he had wished, and nobody could stop it. But Grant, like Lee, had a sense of history, and Grant realized that Lincoln was right when he said something to Grant. He and Grant had met at Grant's headquarters in now what is Hopewell. It was then called City Point. They had met there 2 months before Grant launched the offensive that would bring the war to an end. And Grant and Lincoln talked about the possibilities for post-war, what all would happen when the war was over, and how the nation would come back together, and how the strategy against Lee should unfold. And they tell the story, and if it's not true, it ought to be. They tell the story that as Mr. Lincoln was walking up the gangway to get on his boat and go back to Washington, Grant was standing on the shore puffing on a cigar. And as Lincoln neared the end of the gangway, Grant said, "Mr. President, what do you want me to do with him when I catch him?" And Lincoln turned, and without hesitation, he said, "Let him up easy. Let him up easy." There was another man with a sense of history. And Grant let him up easy. The surrender terms at Appomattox defy belief for the end of a civil war. And they defy belief in how lenient they were. The officers could keep their sidearms to maintain peace back home. Enlisted men with horses could take their horses home. They would be needed for the spring plowing. But ignored among those surrender terms was the most important, in which Grant said the Confederates will sign paroles pledging good conduct, and they can go home, and they are not to be disturbed by federal authorities as long as they obey the law. He said they need to go home and behave themselves, and they are Americans again. It's a miracle if such terms were offered. And obviously Lee was shaken emotionally by the leniency with which this war was ending. But he shouldn't have, because you see, Lee had a choice too at Appomattox. And one of his artillery commanders raised that choice on the morning of April 9, 1865. Porter Alexander, his best artillery officer, came to him and said in essence, "General, don't surrender. Don't give up. We'll fight for you as long as you want to fight. You just tell us, and we'll scatter to the woods. We'll disperse. And we'll hide behind the bushes and behind the rocks and in the woods, and we'll pick them off one by one, and we'll fight guerrilla style, shooting and burning and looting for as long as it takes to wear them out. And then we'll get our independence." And civil wars normally end that way. They're still trying to end the one in Ireland, for example. That's the way civil wars usually end, with a long aftermath of bloodshed and bitterness. Lee said no. He said, in essence, we came into this war honorably to seek our independence. And if I were to agree to what you say, Union soldiers would ramble uninterrupted and unchallenged throughout the South. They would destroy the land. They would do such intense destruction that America would never be able to come back together again. And so, said Lee, I'm surrendering myself to Grant and praying to God that peace may come. And he did. And I'm in the minority. I don't think Lee's brilliance lays as a general. I think it lays in what he did in the 5 years after the Civil War. He refused a number of business opportunities that would have made him some money. Instead, he took the presidency of a small little bankrupt school over in Lexington named Washington College. And he devoted himself not merely to that college, but he spent the last 5 years of his life seeking reconciliation with the North. No American, I repeat, no American worked harder between 1865 and 1870 to bring America together again as much as Robert E. Lee. He was so effective that in 1868, believe it or not, a New York newspaper endorsed Robert E. Lee for President of the United States, a New York paper. The problem was, had Lee been elected, he could not serve. He was not a citizen. His amnesty had not been granted. But in 3 years, this man worked tirelessly to bring about peace. And he continued to do so by examples. Lee is the only major figure in the Civil War who did not write his memoirs. He would not. He didn't want to live through that hell again, for one thing. And secondly, he thought it would be capitalizing on the blood of his men to say again in print what they had suffered and endured and given. He would not attend veterans reunions. He would not attend memorial services, dedication ceremonies. He would not grant interviews with the press. He was the one figure in the 19th century who thoroughly disliked newspapermen. He couldn't trust them, he said. They don't know how to tell the truth. Sound familiar? These are 100 years ago in front of you. He worked tirelessly to make us one people. He would be absolutely ashamed to see the Confederate battle flag waving in the public, anywhere, for any assumed position. He would be ashamed. He would hardly have spoken heatedly against any monument ever put up to his memory, which is exactly why we need those monuments. He is an example of the post-war Christ-like crusade he waged to make us all Americans again. In late September 28, 1870, Lee, who was senior warden at the Episcopal Church locally, endured a long vestry meeting, 3 hours. It was raining and cold outside, the sanctuary was unheated, and he had to become chilled during that long, boring session of church minutiae. And he struggled, and like the nightfall, he struggled the 75 yards up the hill to his home. And he arrived late, and Mrs. Lee chided him for being late for dinner. And as Lee was saying grace, thanking God for the evening meal, he suffered a stroke, from which he never recovered, and he died on October 9th. I say this because it breaks my heart to see the Episcopal Church persecuting Lee as it is doing today. And most of you know the things that are going on. The National Cathedral, in the heat of dead of night, removed the stained glass window of Lee from the National Cathedral and took him away from there, converting, nevertheless, took it away. And yet you go there today and the Episcopal ministers who run the National Cathedral will be proud to show you the burial crypt of President Woodrow Wilson, probably the most outrageous segregationist of his day. While president of Princeton University, Wilson refused even to look at the admission or application of a black man. In World War I, 216,000 American blacks volunteered for the U.S. Army. They volunteered to die for America. Wilson put them in segregated units, commanded all by all white officers. And he continued that policy throughout. And so the church today will be delighted to show you Woodrow Wilson, but they're ashamed of Robert E. Lee. Why? I don't know. I wish I knew why. On the chapel grounds at Fort Hamilton, New York, used to be a plaque that says, in memory of Captain Robert E. Lee, who, while making Fort Hamilton stronger in the 1840s, did so in the glory of God. The Bishop of Long Island had the plaque removed because Lee's name was fouling the earth around that chapel. In Lexington, the church there, since Lee died, has been called the Robert E. Lee Memorial Episcopal Church. The rector recently had the name changed. The name Lee changed. All this while, they're losing congregations. The Lexington Church has lost a third of its membership in the last 6 months. The worst example is right up the river here, in Alexandria, Virginia, Christ Church. It's where Lee worshipped as a boy. It's where George Washington worshipped as a boy. And there are plaques on the pews where each worshipped God. And the minister there had the plaques removed because, she said, they make visitors feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. Robert E. Lee, uncomfortable and unwelcome. And pushed by the press, she finally lost her patience and said, well, this is a church, not a museum. Oh, I looked up the word museum in the dictionary. It means a building specifically for artistic and historical objects. It is worshiping God about as artistic as one can get. Is bowing before the cross as Christians have done for 2,000 years, not historical. And the church has continued to do that. It is free falling toward destruction. And I say that as a former Episcopalian who arose high in the lay ranks of that church. It's almost like they have a psychopathic persecution of Lee taking place. And Lord knows they've lost half of their membership in National Church in the last 20 years. And since they started this crusade against him last year, their loss is going to be even more deeply. And at the risk of sounding sermonic, pretentious, I would like to remind those fellows, those figures, who wear those purple shirts, of a man who once stood on the hillside and said, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Robert E. Lee was a more devout Episcopalian than many of them in control of that dying church are today. So that's the situation with Lee. Now we come to Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson and I enjoyed 7 wonderful years together when I wrote that big book on him. I had the high honor to be historical consultant for the 6-hour movie, Guards and Generals, and so I went all again. I watched Stephen Lang do an absolutely magnificent performance of Stonewall Jackson. I see you nodding your head. Stephen and I remain close friends. It was an incredible job. And one of the most moving scenes in that movie is the morning of the Battle of First Manassas, and some of you will remember Jackson goes out to an open field and he crosses his arms in the old-fashioned way of praying, and he asks God's blessings on all that takes place that day. What makes that so incredible is that Stephen Lang is Jewish. And he pulled off with Jackson with the Academy Award performance. Stonewall Jackson seemed so complicated because he was so simple, very simple to understand him. And I made a biographer's major mistake with the Jackson book. I got personally involved. I just got involved with him. I just couldn't let go of him. I spent 7 years doing a biography, and writers do different approaches to different people. I started off with the intention that no biography had ever been written on Jackson. I never consulted one for about the first 4 years. Instead, I went to primary sources, unpublished diaries, letters and stuff to write Jackson. And I visited his home place in West Virginia and depositories all over the place. And I learned a couple of things about Jackson I'd like to remind you of, because what you think of is this stern, belligerent general who won so brilliantly and led so masterfully in battle. But at heart, they would break your heart. Jackson was an orphan. His father was a ne'er-do-well who died when Jackson was 2, and his mother unable financially to keep him. gave him away when he was 7. And a therapist, and I use 2 of them, a therapist will tell you the age of 7 is critical to your life. It's the first time in your life you begin to reason. You may think you did something. You may vividly recall that you did something at the age of 4 or 5. You don't know. You're bullying us. You're giving us a bull treatment. You don't know. It's only at 7 that you begin to think. And Jackson never got over the sight of riding behind his uncle on a horse and looking back and seeing his mother standing in the road with her arms out, wailing her heart away that his son was leaving forever. Jackson saw her one more time before she died of tuberculosis about 6 months later. The point of all of this is that being an orphan, a total orphan, Jackson had no familial love. Familial love. You know what I mean? Recall your own life. Each one of you sitting there, recall your own life. Try to think what your life would have been without your mother and your father. Try to remember your youth when you were either in jail or ought to be. Some of the things you did. But you knew full well that no matter how bad they were, how offensive they might be to others, you could always run to mom and dad. And they would always hold out their arms. And they would always love you. Jackson never got that. He never knew what love was as a child. And he grew up on one morning, simply another worker on his uncle's farm. He fell in love at the age of 27. The first time he'd ever known love. He fell in love with a minister's daughter. And he awakened a friend of his at 1 o'clock in the morning at nearby Washington College and said, I think something is wrong with me. I get around this alley, I can't think. My mouth gets dry, my eyes don't focus, my brain just doesn't work. I don't know what's wrong with me. And the professor, who obviously was a little upset about being awakened in the middle of the night, said, for God's sakes, Jackson, you were in love. And Jackson said, I'm going to have to think about that. And he thought about it long enough to marry Ellie Junkie. And she was dead 14 months later. She died in childbirth, and the son died with her. Jackson always had death and loneliness about him. Always. Except when he was around children. And were he alive today, he'd be in jail probably, charged with being a pervert. But if he walked in this room tonight, he would be very, very ill because he couldn't stand strangers, large crowds. That again comes from the loss of the lack of love in his young years. But if he came in this crowd tonight and looked around you and saw a young girl, 5, 6, 7, 8, sitting there, he would go immediately to the young girl or the young boy and start a conversation. I'm Tom Jackson. What are you doing here? He did that with every child we ever had. And we worked that into the movie Gods and Generals in the famous Katie Corbin story, when Jackson spent his last winter with headquarters at the Corbin Mansion just downriver from Fredericksburg. And he and young Kate Corbin, she was 7, just got into a father-daughter relationship. And Jackson just loved her intensely. And why? Why would he feel that way? He felt that way because he wanted every young child he could ever touch to know the love, to sense the love he never had. He wanted every being to feel safe and secure because he himself never did. The second big factor about Jackson, and it took about halfway through his search for me to realize this, is his faith. Totally overlooked by great historians like Douglas Freeman and others, his faith. As Reverend Moses Holbrook, the leading Presbyterian minister in Richmond at the time, said, mention Jackson's name without mentioning his faith is like visiting Switzerland and never seeing the Alps. And this is exactly the way it was. Jackson grew up alone, and after graduation from West Point, he entered the Mexican War, and somewhere along that line, in the Mexican War, he began a fascination with God. Where else did he have to turn, one might ask? And for the next 2 or 3 years, in the Mexican War, Fort Meade, Florida, garrison duty, etc., he kept searching for a religious home. He tried the Catholics, Episcopalians, Methodists. Nothing really felt good to him. In 1851, he accepted a faculty position at Virginia Military Institute, and there he found his home, the Lexington Presbyterian Church. And Jackson became not an ardent Presbyterian. I think he became a thoroughgoing Calvinist. He dedicated his life to God. Put another way, God becomes his Father as well as his Heavenly Father. At long last, God has a companion who will be with him always. It won't be an alien 14 years later, heartbreak. God the Father is with him so long as he recognizes it and returns to God the love he knows God is giving to him. And if you accept that overwhelming faith that Jackson had, you can explain the rest of his life quite easily. But for one thing, his sternness as a general. When you went up against Jackson, you were likely not going to survive because he went for the kill. You see, he saw God as the two-faced God we see in the Bible, and not many of us really make a difference. In the Old Testament, it is a belligerent, warlike, demanding Jehovah. And you see this in the story of Joshua besieging Jericho. And the city eventually surrenders. And Joshua and his men go into the city and they slay every man, woman, and child in the name of God. Jackson sees this. If you're going to fight for the Lord, you fight for the Lord from instantly and completely. So unlike any other Confederate soldier, even the sainted Lee, Jackson goes off to the Civil War. He's not fighting. He's not going to fight for secession or Virginia. He's fighting for God. They are not Yankees over there. They are Philistines. They are Amalekites. They must be slain in God's name. And this was easier for him to do because he thought there was an extension to the Holy Bible. Yet there was another part of the gospel called the United States Constitution. He was devoted to it. And in Jackson's mind, the Yankees were taking away the Constitution. They were violating it with their abolitionist tactics and misbehavior. And they needed to be smitten, to be eliminated in the name of the Lord. That's the first God he saw. And then the other God is the one we see, the kind, loving, all-caring Father in the New Testament. And this can easily switch over, and Katie Corbin comes back into view. Jackson loving children versus Jackson the consuming killer. And it was fascinating. It was a journey, the likes of which I've never known, to pass through his 39 years and watch it. And quite frankly, I came away from that book in sheer envy of his faith. God, I wish I had it. I just wish I had it. He just believes so totally in God's will. At VMI, at the beginning of a class when the cadets were coming in, Jackson would bow his head and ask God to give him the knowledge, give him the information and the leadership to impart to these young men something that would be of value to them. And at the end of the class, as they left, he would ask God to follow each of them as they continued their uncertain, often injurious trek into the future. And I go back to thinking when I walked into McBride Auditorium with 577 students sitting there, if I stood at the podium and bowed my head and started saying a prayer, by the end of the hour, the ACLU would have been on me like ticks in heat. They would not have allowed it for Jackson to do that. He's the only man I ever know who would thank God for a glass of water. If he was going to drink water, he would thank God for the gift of water. And when he was fatally wounded at Chancellorsville, and he came to consciousness after the amputation of his left arm, he was not depressed, sad. God had taken his arm for a reason. And for that reason, he would be blessed, and he would be told that he was blessed. Now, how did Jackson feel about slavery? It is so simple that it's hard to comprehend it. God said, Jackson, God has ordained that people of color shall be in bondage. I, as a white man, cannot challenge that. It's the will of God. I can only obey it. I may not like it. I can only obey it and pray to our Heavenly Father that He will in time come and free all men to walk together as brothers. And we developed that scene in the movie Gods and Generals. Many of you may recall it. Lee was riding, Jackson was coming in from the valley to reinforce Lee at Chancellorsville in late November 1862, and they stopped at a little crossroad junction called Chancellorsville. And out in the cold, Jackson and his servant, Jim Lewis, black, got into a conversation, and Jim Lewis said, how come, General, I'm as faithful as you are, but I'm a slave and you are free? And they had exchanged this conversation, which we brought out in the movie. And I think it just shows you how Jackson's faith went. He always hoped that God might ultimately bless him with letting him die on the Lord's Day. And I don't think it's coincidental at all that on Sunday afternoon, May 10th, 1863, Jackson died. Not of pneumonia, that's the one L I have in the book. Physicians have now convinced me, and I'm accepted very willingly, that Jackson died of sepsis. You don't know the word, but sepsis, but you know antiseptic. The stuff like Neosporin you take for wounds. And he had blood poisoning and died on May 10th, 1863. I cannot subscribe to those who say when Jackson died, the South lost the war. That's nonsense. Not even Jackson's brilliance, I think, could turn it around. The South just doesn't have the wherewithal to win that war. And it probably, as I think more on it, probably was a blessing he died during the war. Because I don't think Stonewall Jackson could have survived defeat. He was so convinced that God was with him and that the South would win. I don't know how he would take defeat. Would it be God's beheading of him? I think losing the war would have shaken his faith to the roots. But today, he is, of course, one of the great soldiers of all time, 39 when he died. I was asked recently to do a little encyclopedia on him like I've done for Robert E. Lee. And I refused, saying there's just nothing to write as an encyclopedia. He only lived 39 years, and 10 of them was as a faculty position. So that's dead silence and emptiness. You just can't do it. And I think you see now one of the great actions attached to academia. The fighting is so vicious because the stakes are so small. These academics get into a wild wherewithal over nothing. And, I think a camel is a horse a committee put together at some university. You got it messed up. But we lost Jackson. But Lee still lives. He still lives by the conciliation efforts he made, the attempts to keep our nation oneness which it has become. And so I would say, yes, General Grant won the war, but General Lee saved the peace. Right before Lee died in 1869, he sent a letter, correspondence, just regular correspondence, with his former chief of staff, Charles Marshall, who by then was a very prosperous lawyer in Baltimore. And I think what Lee wrote on the eve of his death is worth repeating. The march of Providence is so slow, and our desires are so impatient. The work of progress is so immense, and our means of aiding it are so feeble. The life of humanity is so long, and that of the individual so brief, that we often see only the ebb of the advancing wave, and thus we are discouraged. But it is history that teaches us to hope. And history is our only hope. And I want you to treat those snowflakes with the contempt they deserve. Shout them down. You can straighten out this mess as easier perhaps than anyone else. because you possess something, a more powerful weapon in politics. You possess the ballot. And if you are coming up and voting for a board of supervisors, a town council, a school board, ask them how they feel about the monument issue. Tell them you want a yes or no answer. You don't want a discourse or a sermon. Yes or no on the monuments. Yes and no on keeping our history alive. Yes or no in forgetting the past. You approach it that way, you can help turn this around, and we must turn it around. If we lose our history, it's much like tearing out a basement. You take away the basement, the house will fall. It's as simple as that. And so I offer again the great plea, Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget. Lest we forget. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, let's open it up for a few questions. I'm sure somebody wants to take issue with something. Or if you'd like to say you enjoy it, fine. Yes,
So everybody can hear it.
If Jackson had not been killed, what would you say about the possibility that we could have won the war and our independence?
No, we couldn't have won the war. Because, first off, and let me answer it simply. You can't say he dies at Chancellorsville. Would that have made any difference for Gettysburg? Well, yeah. If Jackson had survived Chancellorsville, Lee would have made Jackson's foot cavalry the point people, leading march into Pennsylvania. And an army normally marched 10 miles a day. Jackson preferred 18 to 20. And Jackson would have set a pace that by the time the Union Army caught up with them, they'd be up somewhere around Schenectady, New York, or Portland, Maine, for the showdown. So you see, you take this thing, what if, and you just can't work it any other way. Jackson's death was a stunner for the South, and I quote that extensively in the book. The newspapers just went out of sight. Jackson was a member of everybody's family. The people of the South were aware of his fate. He was the Christian soldier. And his death just brought a sorrow that simply could not be described. His body lay in state in the rotunda of the Capitol in Richmond. And it is said that some 25,000 people passed it. And it was springtime. And just to show affection, people, for reasons they couldn't explain, bought flowers and left flowers there. And soon the flowers covered the catafalque and they covered the coffin. And that, my friends, began the custom of sending flowers to a funeral. Goes right back to the sorrow expressed over Jackson. The Army was never the same again. Lee would certainly concede that would, and he demonstrated this. Without Jackson, Lee couldn't make these terrible gambles, these risky things, of sending Jackson out on a wide march as he did at Second Manassas, as he did at Chancellorsville. He just couldn't do that. Without Jackson, Lee has no mobility. And without mobility, he's got to stand up and slug it out, man for man, with a Union Army he simply can't beat. And so without that mobility, with Jackson gone, I think the war pretty much is going to turn out inevitably against him in the long run. But had Jackson lived still, I have enough respect for Abraham Lincoln to know that Lincoln was not going to give up either. Yet Lincoln was going, Lincoln thought the Union was perpetual, and he would give his life if he had to. Well, he had to, as things would turn out. But I don't think Jackson's death would possibly change the future. It just made the future perhaps come a little sooner than it might otherwise. I have a lot of respect for William T. Sherman, who decutted the South in his march to the sea and then up through the Carolinas, burning and looting, taking war to the people. I think that cut the Civil War down by at least a year. And please, when you think about Sherman, remember he lived in the South many, many years. He had more Southern friends than he had Northern friends. And Sherman had great respect for the Southern people. He knew that as long as just the armies were fighting, the people's will would hold up. So he took the war to all the people. And then after the war, incredibly enough, Sherman lectured often, mostly in southern states, where he was recognized and regarded with high esteem for what he did. So again, this is one of these things where you have to look back at what was really there, and look back at how these people really felt, to get an understanding of the times. You can't look at the Civil War in the terms of where we are today and how we function. You know, the Neck, for example, was totally out of war. From right after Virginia seceded, Union gunboats went down the Potomac, came down the Appomattox, and 2 regiments of cavalry sealed off the land approach to the northern neck. That was easy to do. I live in Oak Grove. In Oak Grove, you come up to the stoplight going west toward Fredericksburg, you come up to the stoplight in Oak Grove. And if you'll turn left, you'll go 5 miles and come to the Appomattox. If you turn right, you'll go 3 miles and come to the Potomac. So Oak Grove is where the northern neck is only 8 miles wide. You can use 2 regiments of cavalry, seal it. And that's exactly what they did. The Union did, just seal it. And I've been doing research on the northern neck for 2 or 3 years, and I'd like to do a book on it, but it's not there. The information is just not there. Nobody can get letters out, nobody can get letters in. It was isolated. And I look out at my door, and we're so blessed, Betty and me, with so many gifts. I love you, Sherman. One of it is our home, which is on the Potomac River. And I look out there and I think about the James River Squadron. It had 12 gunboats, and they were always going up and down the Potomac, looking for smugglers coming out of Kinsale, Eastville, areas like that, going up and down. I look out that river and I swear I think I see something. So, you know, the northern neck was out of it. But still, its contributions were many in the war, especially the 40th Virginia regiment that was all based almost entirely from the northern neck. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just 2 or 3 quick comments. My name is Bill Brent. I'm a BMI graduate. In my time, we were required, the statue of Stonewall Jackson stands out in front of the Jackson Arch, which is the main entry and exit at VMI. And we were required to salute Jackson, and we were required to, as we walked down into Lexington past the church, Lee's Chapel, to salute Lee's Chapel. Cadets don't do that anymore. I understand that the Confederate flags have been taken out of Lee's Chapel. I just want to comment on that. Secondly, the point you made about Lee after the war at WNL, at Washington College, he would not have anything to do with VMI or the cadets. I don't think he maybe went over there once or twice for some ceremonial reason, but for the reason that you gave, is that he did not want any kind of military aspect of post-war period, or to support that. And lastly, on your treatise of what caused the war, and God knows, you could go on and on and on forever with that, but I bring to the attention of people here that wonderful scene in the movie Gettysburg, when Chamberlain's brother was talking with some Confederate prisoners that they had captured in Gettysburg, and they were having a conversation. And he said, "Boys, why are you fighting this war?" He says, "Because you're down." And I think maybe that's simplistic, but I think that had a lot to do with it. When Lincoln called up 75,000 conscripts before the war, I think that's probably what turned Lee's attention to the fact that he was going to invade Virginia.
Yeah, you're speaking as a state legislator of that time would be. If you've never read the Ordinance of Secession, which Virginia passed, over and over again it keeps using the word coercion. coercion. Well, again, forget today. Think about the mother state, how long she's been alive, how deeply rooted she is. Virginia had a law on the books that said no militia units of any level can pass across Virginia without the approval of the General Assembly. And it was made clear by Governor Letcher to Lincoln that if you send Union soldiers across the Potomac into Virginia, you are invading our state, and you leave us no choice but to declare war. Now that is state rights. That's what you were talking about, state rights, exerting itself. That is federalism put to the test. And Lincoln, of course, didn't respond to that, but he did tell one of his aides, well, I don't have moles, so I can't go underneath. I don't command birds, so they can't fly over Virginia. They just got to walk across it. And so it was Lincoln's federalism against Letcher's state rightism that played a role there. And let me comment on another comment you made in the beginning about they did indeed take the Confederate flags away from the little place where the great statue of Lee asleep lied. When they did, I wrote a friend of mine in WNL and I said, congratulations, you're halfway there. Now put up American flags around the top and the job will be done as Lee would want it done. They haven't put those American flags up there yet. In fact, I think from what all I hear, WNL would love to shut down that monument, close it to the public, which would be an absolute travesty. And that's when, my dear friends, we don't need a silent majority now. We need a loud majority, putting out the word, enough is enough. Don't mess with our history. You can do whatever you want, but don't mess with my heritage. It's my heritage. It belongs to me. You leave it alone. You let me take care of it. And we have a special word for our protection of our heritage. It's called patriotism. It's love of country. So don't laugh at those snowflakes. Respond to them for the idiots they are, for the undermining they are doing to the greatest nation planet Earth will ever see. Let's keep it. We have to. We don't have a choice. Well, with that, thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
Yes, a quick question. Would you comment? Lee had the option of guerrilla warfare. What was the position of Jefferson Davis, the president, in regards to the surrender or guerrilla warfare?
President Davis had little to do with it. Lee surrendered the army. There is no Confederacy left. Davis wanted to continue the war. He thought somehow, some way, thousands of soldiers were going to materialize out of the dark somewhere. And Davis continued from Danville, which is the last capital of the war, because it's the last time elements of the government met together. And Davis headed southward. And his idea seems to have been to cross the Mississippi, and maybe in Texas or somewhere, set up a new Confederacy. It all seemed so bizarre and weird to us. But you've got to remember as well that Jefferson Davis, for all his faults, loved his country. He was one of the great patriots of the Southern cause. Evil though it might have been, he was a patriot, a nationalist, and worshipped his own country. So he deserves some pity for that, but Davis is pretty much out of it. Once the spring of 1865 rolls around. The Confederacy was born on bayonets, and it died on bayonets. The Confederacy lived as long as its armies lived. And when the armies faded away, so did the nation. The Civil War is not an ugly war. I hate the movie Gone with the Wind. It just portrays the South. It never was. You know, 1,000 Scarlet O'Haras in heat running through the cotton fields and all this other stuff that's taking place. It's just absolute jargon. The average woman in the South was a wife, maybe with 3 young children, on a 50-acre farm, trying to keep herself and her children above starvation, and scared to death one of them will get sick. That's the average woman. They live in filth. They die in agony. They suffer alone. You know, the Confederacy deserves sympathy from within, not for what it preached, which was evil. No one can justify keeping an individual in bondage, except the historical tradition that was there. But that historical tradition vanishes away. In this little book, Civil War Echoes, I did, during the sesquicentennial, I had the idea that there are probably people scattered throughout Virginia who have a lot of letters and diaries in personal possession. And maybe they'd be willing to share them with the Library of Congress, Library of Virginia. And so we sent 2 photographic teams for 4 years around the state. There are 134 voting units in Virginia, 100 counties, 34 cities. And these camera crews stopped at malls and libraries and high schools and whatnot for extended stay 141 times. And we just asked people to bring in your letters, diaries, and photographs. We don't want the originals. We'd like to have them. All we want to do is make a copy so that they'll be available in the Library of Virginia for future use by historians and others. And I had hoped, and I was being optimistic, I had hoped that we would get 1,000 pages of material. We ended up with over 33,000 pages of letters, diaries, and memoirs. And Speaker Bill Howell asked me at the end of the sesquicentennial to put a little sampler together, a little book of hors d'oeuvres of the various things in there. And I went through 10% of the collection. I took 3 times more notes than I used to produce the Civil War Echoes. And they're just quotes from women, men, and what they were feeling as human beings. One of the strangest came from George McSwain, who had enlisted because his neighbors were. And all George was interested in was his little farm and his wife's cell and their 2 children. And when George left, the family got in need. That is, didn't have the manpower there, they didn't have any help, and they were in bad shape. So twice, George McSwain went home. He lived just across the border in North Carolina. He went home on unauthorized leave. And twice he came back, and they caught him on the second comeback. And he sends a letter to his wife that began, "My dear Sarah, this is the last letter you will ever receive from me because on Saturday I am to be shot to death for desertion." And then he goes on to talk about, at least I'll be away from all this sadness, this loneliness, etc. And I can live in death for the day when you and the children and I can be together again for all time to come. And 3 days later on Saturday, they shot him. And then it just tales like this. A wonderful collection came from a man from Heathville. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Heathville, but his name was Henry Clay DeShields. I don't know if that rings a bell with anybody. He was an attorney in Heathville, and DeShields became a major in the quartermaster's department and just sent his wife in Heathville tremendously revealing letters. They ought to be published separately. And then the women, just the way that they write, and the phonetic spelling which they used at that time. You know. And I love reading Civil War letters for phonetic spelling. You know, the thicker the accent, the more incredible becomes the way they spelled it. Throughout my career, I've kept a running tab on how many different ways you spell diarrhea. I'm at 22, and that doesn't include the S word. Why that? Because it's the biggest killer in the Civil War, dysentery. It will kill more men than bullets. And the problem is the surgeons had no idea what it was or what to do about it. You know, if it was just regular, it was diarrhea. If it had blood in it, it was dysentery. That's the only differentiation they can make. Well, now, of course, you and I today, with our layman's knowledge, know that you can get diarrhea from 50 different ways. But they didn't. And so once the diarrhea starts, the soldier's life just hinges on it. The third biggest killer, bullets the second, the third biggest killer is typhoid fever. Because an army would encamp along the river, and half the men would use it for drinking water, and the other half would use it as a latrine. And it's still active. They had an outbreak of it last summer in Richmond, Well, the homeless living at the James River, where you're drinking James River water and coming down with typhoid fever. Still extremely, extremely deadly. And you hear often the phrase scarlet fever, heard talked about in Civil War time. Someone comes down with scarlet fever, and you think to yourself, oh goodness, at least we don't have that now. Yes, we do. All of us have had it probably one time or another. Today it's called strep throat. And you take an antibiotic, a couple of days later you're fine. But Janie Corbin, the little girl that Jackson befriended and loved, the last one of his life, that dies from scarlet fever. And Ron Maxwell and I the director and I had a little bit of about it, because I saw the first run of the film, and Janie is very white. As she lies near death, and I called Ron and said, I'm going to tell you this very, very simply now. I hope you're listening. It's called scarlet fever because you turn red. Well, he said it's too late to refilm, but so we lost that battle. Though we saved some other scenes in the movie. But if you remember the limited knowledge of that time and how these people suffered, what they finally attained, and the very fact that they survived, is the way to go with it. And this little teaser, this Civil War Echoes, is just a great little book to get familiar with the common people, who, after all, have always been the base of the American dream, the common folk. You know, one thing historians always argue about, is a general only as good as his men, or are the men only as good as that general? Well, I would think it's the men that really hold the key there in what they did. And that these young men, students and clerks, laborers, farmers, would do the things they did in that war. And they did it for us. And we are God's chosen people because of them. And we must never forget that. That's why the monument thing must continue. We must build more memorials to them. Everyone who perished in that war gave his life for us. You have memorials to these soldiers already. Each one of you does. In the middle of the war, post offices in the South and the North as well became the centers of mourning, because people would come there twice a week to get their mail. And eventually, well, both or all of them are going to get that letter, which says this brother or this father or this son not coming home, he died. And so the local post offices became the city's wailing wall, if you will. And postal officials just said, it's embarrassing. People do nothing but cry. And postal authorities agreed. And in 1864, we got another of many firsts in the Civil War. What was it? Home delivery of mail. That box by your door, that box down there on the post by your curbing, is a memorial to a Civil War soldier who did not come home. That's the kind of thing you need to remember. I must quit now. We've gone long enough, but I'll take your